Dead America, Tales from Las Vegas, The Tunnels, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. South side of Vegas, 10:37 p.m. Nathan and Fiona sat on the concrete sidewalk outside the late-night pharmacy, their backs pressed against the cool brick wall of the building as they watched a steady stream of people walking in and out of the brightly lit store. The neon signs from the surrounding businesses cast shifting patterns of red and blue light across their faces, while the distant sounds of slot machines and traffic provided the constant background noise that defined Las Vegas after dark. Nathan was in his early 20s, but life on the street had treated him roughly, aging him beyond his years. He still retained some of his youthful features, but his frame had become thin and wiry due to the lack of regular meals and the constant stress of survival. Unlike many people who ended up living on the streets, he didn't have a substance abuse problem that had led to his current circumstances. When he turned 18, his foster family had unceremoniously evicted him from their home the day after his birthday. Rather than having a loving family to provide support and guidance as he transitioned into adulthood, he had ended up with a pair of grifters who only cared about the monthly stipend they received for housing him. The moment that money stopped flowing, they had no use for him. His companion that evening, Fiona, had taken the more traditional route to the streets of Las Vegas. Her gambling problem had gradually morphed into a drinking problem, which had systematically stripped away her home, her job, and eventually her sanity. The past 5 years had been incredibly tough on her physically and emotionally, but they had also been positive in some unexpected ways. She had been sober for 2 years, give or take a few small slips, though she would still occasionally play cards with the regulars who lived down in the storm drain tunnels. Fiona looked up hopefully as a well-dressed couple approached the pharmacy entrance, putting on her most polite smile in the hopes that they might spare some change. The man wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, while his female companion sported designer clothes and jewelry that caught the light from the store's windows. Rather than reaching into their pockets to help, they both stared down at the redhead with undisguised contempt, as if they couldn't believe that people like her had the audacity to try and engage with their social betters. "Why don't you go crawl back into the hole you came from?" the man said with venom. Fiona had heard variations of this insult countless times over the years, but the cruelty behind the words still stung every time. Nathan, on the other hand, had never been one to take such treatment lying down, especially when it was directed at someone he cared about. "Hey, I know you," Nathan said, pointing at the man with recognition. "Yeah, you were coming out of the Full House casino with your wife a couple weeks back, when I asked you for a couple of bucks." Nathan trailed off for a moment, staring intently at the woman beside the man and putting on an exaggerated expression of confusion. "But wait," Nathan continued slowly. "This wasn't the woman you were pawing all over that night. She was easily 20 years younger and had a much bigger set of—" "You shut your mouth before I shut it for you," the man interrupted, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. Nathan put his hands up in a gesture of mock surrender, clearly enjoying the man's discomfort. "Hey, I'm not one to judge," Nathan said with false innocence. "If an open relationship is your thing, more power to you." The man stared at Nathan with pure hatred, while his wife grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the store entrance, her own face now red with humiliation. Nathan gave them a friendly, mocking wave as they disappeared inside before bursting into laughter at their expense. "I don't think Oliver is going to be happy with you for insulting his customers," Fiona said, with a mixture of amusement and concern. "He'll get over it," Nathan replied confidently. "I'm betting he doesn't like assholes like that any more than we do." "Still, it's a risk, because we really need his help tonight," Fiona pointed out. "I know, but I'm not going to let people talk to you like that," Nathan said firmly. Fiona smiled at her younger friend and gave him a playful smack on the arm. "It's not often someone steps up to defend my honor," she said warmly. "I don't care what anybody says," Nathan replied seriously. "You deserve respect." Fiona smiled again at the young man's loyalty, but her expression changed to concern as she saw the angry customer stomping back out of the store, with Oliver following close behind him. Oliver was the head pharmacist and closing manager of the establishment. He was in his late 20s with sandy brown hair and kind eyes that reflected a genuine concern for the less fortunate residents of the city. Despite his sympathy for people like Nathan and Fiona, he let out a visible sigh as soon as he spotted the duo sitting on the sidewalk outside his workplace. "This is the man who verbally assaulted me," the customer declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Nathan. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Oliver replied diplomatically. "I'll take care of it." "You better, or else I'm going to get the cops involved," the man threatened. Nathan threw up his hands in another mocking gesture, completely unfazed by the threat. "Oh no, we might get a soft bed to sleep in and a few hot meals on the county's dime," Nathan said sarcastically. "Whatever will we do?" The man began opening his mouth to spew more venom in their direction, but Oliver quickly interrupted him before the situation could escalate further. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait inside while I handle this," Oliver said, with enough authority to make it clear this wasn't a request. The customer reluctantly retreated back into the pharmacy, muttering under his breath about the declining standards of customer service. Once he was safely out of earshot, Oliver turned his attention to the two homeless individuals. "Nathan, come on, man. What have I told you about harassing the customers?" Oliver asked with exasperation. "Hey, man, I was on my best behavior until he told Fiona here to crawl back into her hole where she belonged," Nathan explained defensively. Oliver's demeanor shifted from annoyed to understanding as he processed this information. "He said that to you, Fiona?" Oliver asked, looking at her with concern. She gave a half-hearted nod, still feeling the sting of the man's words. "Well, in that case, I think I just ran out of those little blue pills he came here for," Oliver said with a slight smile. "I knew it," Nathan said with satisfaction. Nathan smirked as Fiona gave him another playful smack on the leg for being right about Oliver's character. "But look, Nathan, I can't have you hanging around out here anymore tonight because I'm pretty sure he's going to call the cops," Oliver explained. "We'll get out of your hair, but first we need—" Nathan began. Oliver held up his hand, cutting Nathan off before he could finish his request. "I've given you all I can, Nathan, at least for right now," Oliver said reluctantly. "The owner is getting a little suspicious that so much inventory is going missing. Oliver, we don't want to put you in a difficult position, and we're unbelievably thankful for all the medicine and supplies you've given to our community over the past year. It's just that—" Nathan tried to explain. "Just nothing, Nathan," Oliver interrupted firmly. "I can't risk my job right now." Fiona stood up from her position on the sidewalk, stepping closer to Oliver and speaking from a place of sincere desperation. She usually let Nathan do most of the talking in these situations, which is why Oliver was caught off guard by her direct approach. "Oliver, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't important," Fiona said earnestly. "So many people back in the tunnels are sick, like really sick. I don't think some of them are going to make it through the night unless we can get some medicine to them." Fiona's voice was nearly breaking as she spoke, her emotion tugging at Oliver's heartstrings. He could see the fear and concern in her eyes as she thought about the suffering members of their underground community. Oliver contemplated the situation for a long moment, weighing the risks to his career against the human cost of refusing to help. Finally, he nodded his head in resignation. "Okay, it's going to take me a little while to put something together. Maybe an hour," he said quietly. "But I'll put a box of flu medication and some other supplies out by the dumpster in the alley." "Thank you so much, Oliver," Fiona said with overwhelming gratitude. Fiona stepped forward and gave him a quick hug before backing away apologetically. "I'm sorry. I know you probably don't want a hug from someone who sleeps in a tunnel," she said self-consciously. "It's okay, Fiona," Oliver reassured her gently. Oliver reached into his pocket and pulled out a money clip, peeling off a $20 bill and handing it to her. "Why don't the two of you go over to the diner down the block and get yourselves a cup of coffee?" he suggested. "We really appreciate everything you do for us, Oliver," Nathan said sincerely. "You can show that appreciation by not being here when Limpy comes back out of the store," Oliver replied with a slight grin. All three of them chuckled at the unflattering nickname for the angry customer before Nathan and Fiona began walking away from the pharmacy. "Give me an hour and the supplies will be out there behind the building," Oliver called after them. They had walked about 20 feet when Oliver called out once more from the front of the store. "And if anybody's condition gets worse, come see me tomorrow," he added with concern. Fiona and Nathan both gave him a thankful wave before continuing their journey toward the all-night diner down the block. As they walked along the cracked sidewalk, Fiona held up the $20 bill that the pharmacist had given her, examining it in the light from the street lamps. "So, what do you say?" she asked with a smile. "Can a girl buy the defender of her honor a cup of coffee and a piece of pie?" "I would be honored," Nathan replied with mock formality. Nathan extended his arm in an old-fashioned gesture, allowing Fiona to slide her arm through his as they strolled down the street toward their destination. Chapter 2. 11:42 p.m. Nathan and Fiona exited the diner, laughing and generally just enjoying themselves as they stepped back onto the sidewalk. The warm night air carried the scent of grease and coffee from the restaurant behind them, mixing with the ever-present aroma of exhaust fumes and distant cigarette smoke that defined the Vegas streets after midnight. It was rare that they had the chance to sit down and enjoy a simple treat like a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie, so they had made sure to savor every moment of their brief respite from the harsh realities of street life. The diner had been nearly empty, except for a few late-night workers grabbing a quick meal between shifts, and a couple of casino employees taking their break. The fluorescent lighting had been harsh, but the vinyl booth seats were comfortable enough, and the pie had been surprisingly good for a place that probably saw more homeless people than paying customers. They began the short walk back to the pharmacy, which was now completely dark inside, the bright neon open sign switched off for the night. The building looked different in the darkness, less welcoming and more like just another closed business in a string of establishments that catered to the night shift workers and insomniacs who kept the city running after hours. "So wait, you really partied with them when they came through on tour?" Nathan asked, still processing the story Fiona had been telling him over dessert. "Oh yeah, believe it or not, I was hot in my youth, and rest assured I used that to my advantage." "I bet you did, but still, getting backstage with them couldn't have been easy." "Well, I happened to know that the guitar player had a thing for redheads, so I made sure to plant myself in the front row right across from him. A couple of seductive looks and an inappropriate gesture or two, and I had a backstage pass in my hand before the encore." "That's crazy. I remember listening to their music back when I had something to listen to their music on," Nathan said with a rueful smile. Both of them let out a laugh, though it was more of a defense mechanism than amusement. The reminder of how much they had lost was always lurking just beneath the surface of even their lightest conversations. "I was a huge fan too back in the day, which is why I was so pissed when I didn't get on the tour bus," Fiona continued. "I can't believe you couldn't get on the bus. What happened?" Nathan asked. "Well, the guitar player and I had our fun in the dressing room," Fiona said with a mischievous grin. "And when it was time to leave, I was ready to hit the road and see where the adventure would take me. Unfortunately, that's when his girlfriend paid him a surprise visit." "I'm assuming she wasn't into redheads?" Nathan asked with mock seriousness. Fiona let out a laugh, shaking her head at the memory. "No, she most certainly was not. And I don't think she was that into guitar players after that night either, assuming he survived, of course. She was verbally ripping him a new one when they were getting on the bus." "Well, for what it's worth, I'm sorry you missed your chance," Nathan said with sincerity. "It's probably for the best," Fiona replied philosophically. "Besides, their next album sucked, so I wouldn't have been with them all that long anyway." Both of them broke out into laughter as they walked into the narrow alley behind the pharmacy, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. They spotted the cardboard box of flu medicine, waiting exactly where Oliver had promised to leave it, sitting beside the large dumpster like a small beacon of hope in the urban landscape. Nathan grabbed the box, noting its surprising weight, before handing the handwritten note that was taped to the top over to Fiona. "What's it say?" he asked. "I hope your friends get better," Fiona read aloud, touched by the pharmacist's simple but heartfelt message. "I think he means it, because there's got to be 10 bottles of various medications in here," Nathan said, peering into the box. "We better get it back to the tunnels then. Diesel will start worrying if we're out too much later," Fiona said, glancing at her watch. Nathan nodded in agreement, and the two of them headed back to the main street, walking south away from the commercial district toward their unconventional home in the storm-drained tunnels that ran beneath the city. It wasn't a traditional home by any stretch of the imagination, but it served its purpose for them and scores of other people who had nowhere else to go. Underneath the sprawling city of Las Vegas stretched an intricate labyrinth of flood prevention tunnels. Hundreds of miles of concrete and steel infrastructure crisscrossed beneath the streets, designed to keep the surface roads clear and functional in the event of the flash floods that could strike the desert with little warning. The tunnel system had become an unintended sanctuary for the city's homeless population, providing shelter from both the elements and the authorities who periodically swept the visible areas where street people tended to congregate. It was a harsh environment, but it offered a degree of safety and community that was impossible to find on the surface. It was a good mile walk from the pharmacy to their destination, but the relatively cool desert air made the trek bearable, even while carrying their precious cargo. The duo chatted easily along the route, their conversation covering everything from shared memories to plans for distributing the medicine among their sick friends. However, their light-hearted discussion gradually fell quiet about a quarter mile from their destination. "I don't want you to panic, but I think someone is following us," Fiona said in a low voice, her street-smart instincts kicking in. "The car about a block back?" Nathan asked, having noticed the same thing. "Yeah, it's been creeping along behind us for at least a minute now. It's gone through 2 green lights without accelerating through the intersection," Fiona observed. "What do you want to do?" Nathan asked, trusting her judgment in these situations. "Just keep walking normally and watch it until it gives us a real reason to run," Fiona replied calmly. "I'll follow your lead," Nathan said. The two of them continued their steady pace down the sidewalk, with Fiona periodically checking over her shoulder to keep tabs on the suspicious vehicle. The street was mostly empty at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of music and laughter drifting from the casinos several blocks away. Just before they reached the next intersection, the car suddenly accelerated, speeding past them and cutting directly in front of their path. The tires skidded to a halt with a loud screech, and the driver laid on the horn in an apparent attempt to frighten them into submission. Nathan and Fiona stood frozen on the sidewalk, unsure how to respond to this sudden display of aggression. After a few tense moments filled only with the sound of the idling engine, the man from their earlier confrontation at the pharmacy stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him with enough force to make the entire vehicle shake. "I'm gonna beat your ass, boy," the man declared, his voice filled with rage and alcohol. "Oh look, it's Limpy," Nathan said with false cheer, refusing to be intimidated. The man became visibly enraged by the mocking nickname, his face flushing red as he began marching toward the duo with clenched fists. Nathan quickly handed the box of medicine over to Fiona before stepping protectively in front of her, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. Nathan shifted into a defensive stance, preparing himself for what seemed like an inevitable fight. The man had a good 6 inches of height and at least 50 pounds of muscle on Nathan's lean frame, but that physical disadvantage wasn't going to stop him from defending his friend and their life-saving cargo. Before the angry man could get within striking distance, he suddenly froze at the sound of thundering footsteps coming from across the street. All 3 of them turned to look toward the source of the noise, spotting 2 figures sprinting toward them. The approaching figures' faces were twisted with rage and covered in what appeared to be fresh blood, as if they had recently been feasting on something or someone. Their clothes were torn and stained, and they moved with a jerky, unnatural gait that immediately triggered every survival instinct Nathan and Fiona possessed. The well-dressed man stood paralyzed in fear as the creatures approached, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The situation was so far outside his normal experience that he simply couldn't react quickly enough to protect himself. Excited moans filled the night air just before the 2 creatures reached their target, finally snapping the man out of his paralysis. He turned to try to defend himself, but it was far too late. The pair of attackers slammed into him with tremendous force, easily knocking him off his feet and sending him crashing down onto the concrete sidewalk. Nathan and Fiona stared in complete disbelief as their unexpected rescuers began tearing into the man with their teeth, ripping chunks of flesh from his arms and torso with animalistic ferocity. His agonized screams pierced the night air, drowning out the sounds of moaning and wet chewing that filled them both with a primal terror they had never experienced before. The 2 friends might have remained frozen in shock indefinitely, but their stupor was broken when they heard additional footsteps coming from behind them. They turned to see 3 more blood-covered figures coming around the side of a building about a block away, running in their direction with the same unnatural speed and apparent attraction to the noise of violence. "Run! We have to run!" Nathan shouted, snapping into action. Nathan grabbed the box of medicine from Fiona's hands before taking hold of her wrist and pulling her out into the middle of the street. The two feasting ghouls continued their horrific work on the screaming man, completely ignoring the fleeing pair as they focused entirely on their current meal. The two friends pumped their legs as hard as they could, drawing on every ounce of speed their lean frames could muster as they raced down the street toward the relative safety of the tunnels. Despite the duo's speed, the pursuing creatures were steadily closing the distance between them. Nathan risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his heart sink as he saw that their pursuers were now within half a block and gaining ground with each stride. "Warehouse! The warehouse!" Nathan shouted. Nathan and Fiona reached the edge of the commercial district at the next block, cutting across an overgrown vacant lot that led to a large abandoned warehouse about 100 yards away. The terrain was uneven and filled with hidden obstacles, making it treacherous to navigate in the darkness. But it was their best hope of escape. They could hear the excited moaning of their pursuers growing louder behind them, though the sound was temporarily muffled when a couple of the creatures apparently face-planted into the rough ground, getting tripped up by the challenging terrain. This small stroke of luck bought them just enough time to reach the chain-link fence that surrounded the warehouse property. Nathan grabbed the corner section of the fence, pulling it back to create an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. Fiona dropped to her hands and knees and scrambled through the gap as quickly as possible, her clothes catching briefly on the sharp edges of the wire. Once she was safely on the other side, Nathan released his grip and allowed his partner to grab the fence from the interior, pulling it up just enough for him to squeeze through the opening. He scrambled to his feet just as the first zombie reached the barrier, slamming into the chain link with enough force to make the entire section rattle violently. The creature was well dressed, most likely a tourist who had been out for a night on the town, but was now missing a substantial chunk of flesh from his side. His expensive shirt was soaked with blood, and his eyes had taken on a vacant, predatory quality that made Nathan's skin crawl. A moment later, the other two ghouls caught up to their companion, smacking against the fence with their fists and pressing their faces against the wire mesh. However, they made no effort to find or create an opening that would allow them to continue their pursuit. Nathan and Fiona backed away from the fence, moving to one side so they were no longer in front of the opening they had used. They watched in horrified fascination as the creatures continued their futile assault on the barrier, seemingly unaware that there was a way through just a few feet away. "Nathan, what's wrong with them?" Fiona whispered, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. "I don't know, Fiona," Nathan replied, equally disturbed by what they had witnessed. "I just know that I don't want them anywhere near us." "We need to get back to the tunnels," Fiona said with urgency. "Diesel needs to know what's going on out here." Nathan glanced over his shoulder, spotting the bulk of the abandoned warehouse about 30 yards directly behind their current position. The building loomed dark and silent in the night, but it represented their best route to safety and ultimately back to their underground home. "When I say go, you turn and run straight to the warehouse door," Nathan instructed quietly. "Okay, I can do that," Fiona replied, steeling herself for another sprint. "Good, now let's go," Nathan commanded. The two of them spun around and ran as fast as their tired legs could carry them, covering the distance to the building's entrance in a matter of seconds. Nathan reached the door first, grabbing the handle and pushing it open while scanning the darkened interior for any signs of movement. Fiona paused in the doorway, unable to resist looking back at the creatures who were still pressing against the fence. They hadn't moved from their position and were still trying to break through the barrier rather than searching for an alternative route around or over it. She found their behavior curious and unsettling, but pushed the observation out of her mind when Nathan grabbed her hand and pulled her inside. "Do you still have that little flashlight?" Nathan asked. Fiona pulled a tiny LED flashlight from her pocket and switched it on. The beam was just bright enough to illuminate about 5 feet in front of them, which would be sufficient to navigate through the warehouse without getting tripped up or falling through any holes in the floor. "Come on, follow me," Fiona said, taking the lead. "I'll get us home." Chapter 3. It took the duo several minutes to carefully navigate through the darkened warehouse, their small flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness as they made their way through. Despite being abandoned for years, the massive building was still a maze of broken machinery, scattered office furniture, and industrial equipment that had been left behind when the business closed. Before too long, however, Fiona's familiarity with the building allowed her to lead them safely through a heavy metal door that opened onto the loading docks. The night air hit them like a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere inside the warehouse, carrying with it the familiar sense of the desert and the distant sounds of the city that never truly slept. Across the open space was the entrance to the tunnel system that had become their home. There was a large concrete reservoir area on the left side, designed to collect and channel floodwaters during the rare but devastating flash floods that could strike Las Vegas. On the right side were multiple tunnel entrances, dark circular openings that led into the underground labyrinth where dozens of homeless individuals had created their own hidden community. In the middle of the complex, positioned near the maintenance entrance that served as the main access point for their underground society, they could see a familiar figure standing tall and alert, keeping watch for their safe return. Diesel was an imposing presence even in the dim lighting, large, muscular, and radiating the kind of no-nonsense authority that came from years of military service. He had spent the better part of a decade working as a mechanic in the Army, hence the nickname that had followed him into civilian life. Despite his serious demeanor and intimidating physical presence, those who knew him well understood that he had a soft heart, especially when it came to protecting and caring for the vulnerable people who had come to depend on his leadership. "Well, there's a sight for sore eyes. Come on, let's get home," Nathan said with relief. The two friends hopped down from the loading dock, their feet hitting the pavement with thuds before they began running toward another gap in the chain-link fence that surrounded the warehouse. As they moved across the open ground, they kept their eyes peeled for any sign of the creatures that had been pursuing them earlier, but the area was deserted. They quickly reached the metal ladder that led up to the maintenance entrance, its rungs worn smooth by countless hands over the years. As they began their ascent, Diesel walked over to greet them, his heavy boots clanging against the metal grating of the platform. "I was beginning to get worried. I know there's not a curfew here, but I like knowing my people are safe," Diesel said, extending his powerful hand to help them up. Diesel reached down and pulled Fiona up to the landing with ease before turning his attention to the box of medicine that Nathan was carefully carrying. "I know, Diesel, but I think you'll agree that our late-night excursion was worth it," Nathan replied as he climbed onto the platform. Nathan got to his feet and gave the big man a meaningful nod, encouraging him to look inside the cardboard container they had risked so much to obtain. Diesel's weathered face broke into a huge smile when he saw the treasure trove of medicine bottles and pill packages nestled inside. "How did you manage this?" Diesel asked with amazement. "Oliver is a good guy, and he came through for us," Fiona explained simply. "Well, let's get this to the people who need it," Diesel said, turning toward the entrance. Diesel began heading toward the heavy metal door that led into the tunnel system, but Nathan and Fiona remained rooted in place, which clearly confused their leader. "Well, what are you waiting on?" he asked, looking back at them with puzzlement. "I need you to promise that you'll stay calm," Fiona said seriously. Diesel's expression shifted to high alert at those words, knowing from experience that the only time Fiona would make such a request was when she was trying to prevent him from tracking down someone who had hurt his people. "Who hurt you, and where are they?" he demanded, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Fiona held up her hands in a calming gesture, trying to defuse his protective instincts before they could spiral out of control. "They're by the front of the warehouse," she said carefully. "Well, the one smart thing they did was not follow you inside," Diesel replied. "That's the thing, Big D. I don't think they were smart," Nathan interjected. "What are you talking about?" Diesel asked with confusion. "They weren't trying to climb the fence or get through the hole. They just tried to push through it to get to us," Nathan explained, still struggling to make sense of what they had witnessed. "Something was wrong with them." "Like, really wrong?" Fiona added with a shudder. Diesel stared at her with growing confusion, trying to understand what could have shaken two of his most street-smart residents so badly. "About a block up from the warehouse, a couple people jumped this guy that was threatening us. But they didn't just jump him, they bit him," Nathan continued. "Old-school playground style, crude but effective," Diesel said with a shrug. "You don't understand. They were biting him like they wanted to eat him. I'm pretty sure they ripped out a chunk or two, and I think—" Nathan trailed off, still processing the horrific scene. "Did you start taking drugs, Nathan?" Diesel asked. "He's telling the truth, Diesel. I've never seen anything like it. And coming from me, that's saying something, Fiona said firmly. Diesel studied both of their faces carefully, looking for any sign of deception or delusion. After a long moment, he nodded his head in acceptance of their account. Well, if they aren't here, then it's not my problem. But I'm not going to take any chances. I'll get somebody to keep watch while we hand out the meds, he decided. I don't mind keeping watch while you do that, Fiona volunteered. No, you've done enough, Fiona. Besides, they're going to want to thank the person responsible for getting them the meds, Diesel replied. Hey, I was there too, Nathan protested. Yeah, but you batting your eyelashes just comes off as creepy. When she does it, it's cute, Diesel said with a rare grin. The three of them broke into a brief fit of laughter, the humor providing a welcome release from the tension of the evening's events. Following Diesel's lead, they made their way through the maintenance door, which was constructed from heavy-duty metal designed to withstand the forces of rushing floodwater. The lock mechanism had been broken out years ago by previous residents, allowing them easy access to their underground sanctuary. As they crossed the threshold into the tunnel system, Diesel grabbed a small solar-powered camping lantern that sat on a metal shelf by the entrance. He clicked it on, casting a warm yellow glow that illuminated their immediate surroundings and pushed back the oppressive darkness that filled the concrete passages. The first section of the tunnel was relatively straightforward, running approximately 30 yards in a straight line before reaching the first major intersection. The walls were made of reinforced concrete, and the floor had a slight downward slope designed to encourage water flow during flood events. As they approached the branching point, they could hear the distant sounds of laughter and conversation, echoing from a section about 15 yards down one of the side passages. Looks like Wanda has a crowd tonight. Come on, Diesel said. Diesel made the turn, leading the group down the darkened pathway while the sounds of talking and laughter grew steadily louder as they approached their destination. Before long, they were standing outside of a breakaway room that had been carved out of the side of the main tunnel, creating a small living space that offered some privacy and protection from the elements. Long strands of colorful beads hung across the entrance, serving as a makeshift door. Despite the informal nature of the entrance, Diesel respectfully called out, "Knock, knock," to announce their presence rather than simply barging in. "Come on in, I'm telling stories," came a warm female voice from inside. Wanda was a woman in her 50s who held the distinction of being the longest-term resident of this particular tunnel community. Nearly 2 decades of living underground had transformed her into the community's unofficial historian and storyteller. If something interesting, funny, or important happened in their hidden world, Wanda knew about it and was always happy to share the tale with anyone willing to listen. "I'm sorry for interrupting, Wanda," Diesel said as they pushed through the bead curtain. "You're not interrupting anything, hun. Come on in. Join us," Wanda replied warmly from her position on a collection of salvage cushions and blankets. Diesel looked around the small space, which had been decorated with found objects and personal belongings that created a surprisingly cozy atmosphere. He spotted 2 other residents who were regulars in Wanda's evening storytelling sessions. Ice was a blonde woman in her mid-30s who had been living with their community for the past 2 years after losing her house to a devastating gambling addiction that had consumed her savings, her credit, and eventually her home. Despite the hardships that had brought her to the tunnels, she had maintained an optimistic outlook and had become one of the more reliable members of their underground family. Vernon was approximately the same age as Diesel, though he carried himself with a more surly and suspicious attitude toward the world. His years working as a bouncer in various Las Vegas establishments had given him extensive experience dealing with trouble, making him the unofficial peacekeeper within their community when disputes arose between residents. "Is everything okay, Diesel?" Ice asked, sensing the tension in their leader's demeanor. "I think we're okay, Ice, but you know me, always overcautious. Would you mind keeping watch by the front door?" Diesel requested. "Sure, but what am I looking for?" Ice replied. Diesel looked back toward Nathan and Fiona, encouraging them to explain the situation in their own words. "We got chased by some crazy people on our way back from the pharmacy with the meds for the sick folks," Fiona said simply. "We lost them at the warehouse, but there might be more of them around," Nathan added. "More of them? Did you piss off a gang or something?" Vernon asked. "I wish we knew, Vernon. All we know is that some people went crazy and started biting people," Fiona replied with a helpless shrug. "Yeah, that sounds crazy all right," Vernon said skeptically. Ice, why don't you check that bucket over there in the corner? I'm pretty sure there's a chain and a padlock in there, Wanda suggested, pointing toward a collection of salvage supplies. What do you think, Diesel? Do you mind if I lock us down? Ice asked. With these two back safe and sound, everybody should be inside. So, yeah, go ahead and lock it down, Diesel agreed. Okay, I'll do that. Then I'll be in my spot if you need me, Ice said, getting to her feet. I appreciate it, Ice, Diesel replied. If you don't mind, I'll tag along while you pass out the meds. I want to check on a few of the people before I turn in, Vernon offered. The more the merrier, come on, Diesel said, welcoming the additional help. Diesel led the small group out of Wanda's living space, guiding them down the concrete pathway to another major intersection in the tunnel system. He turned left, leading them along a massive open area that featured an 8-foot-wide gap in the center of the walkway that dropped down several feet into a lower channel. This was one of the main drainage arteries where rainwater would collect and filter through before finding its way to one of the larger reservoir areas. On either side of the dropped middle section were numerous breakout areas where residents had established their individual living spaces, creating an underground neighborhood of sorts. The alcoves had originally been designed to serve as overflow chambers in case of unexpectedly heavy rainfall that exceeded the system's normal capacity. However, in all the years that Diesel had been living in the tunnels, such an event had only occurred once, so most people felt reasonably safe establishing permanent residence in these spaces. How many bottles do we have? Diesel asked as they walked. 7, and I think there are a couple boxes of pills too. But in my experience, the liquid does the trick, Fiona replied. Well, last time I counted we had 35 people who had come down with whatever this is. There's what, 10 doses a bottle? Diesel calculated. Fiona used her small flashlight to illuminate the back of one of the medicine bottles, reading the dosage information and doing some quick mental math. That sounds about right, she confirmed. So I say we give everybody a dose tonight and give them some pills in the morning. After that, we'll see who the sickest are and figure it out from there, Diesel proposed. Sounds like a plan to me, Vernon agreed. Diesel stopped outside one of the makeshift living spaces, which had a bright blue plastic tarp hanging across the entrance to provide privacy and protection from drafts. He pulled the tarp back slightly and called out to announce their presence. Hey, Skinny, you awake? He called softly. He listened carefully for a response, hearing some indistinct muttering from inside the small space. Satisfied that the resident was conscious, he nodded and took the medicine box from Fiona while handing her one of the bottles. Fiona, would you mind taking it into him? Diesel requested. Fiona let out a small sigh, not particularly enjoying Skinny's company, but willing to help nonetheless. She stepped through the plastic tarp barrier, using her flashlight to illuminate the cramped living space until she spotted the man sitting up against the back wall. Skinny was exactly as his nickname suggested, thin as a rail, and clearly suffering from the illness that was ravaging his already weakened body. He was conscious, but appeared to be in considerable pain, his face gaunt and his breathing labored. Hey, Skinny, I got something that will make you feel better, Fiona said gently as she approached. Fiona moved closer to the sick man while opening the medicine bottle and carefully measuring out the appropriate dose. She offered the small plastic cup to him, but his hands were shaking too badly from fever and weakness to take it himself. Rather than risk spilling the precious medication, she stepped closer and carefully positioned the container near his lips. It's going to taste nasty, but it'll make you feel better, she warned him. The man nodded weakly and allowed her to help him drink the medicine, wincing at the bitter taste, but managing to get it all down. As Fiona turned to head back toward the entrance, she heard the sound of thundering footsteps echoing throughout the tunnel system, putting her on high alert. She remained behind the cover of the tarp barrier, waiting until she heard a familiar male voice speaking before stepping back out into the main passage. The words came out ragged and breathless, as if the speaker had been running hard, making it difficult for anyone to understand what he was trying to communicate. As she emerged from Skinny's living space, she spotted Robert approaching their group at a rapid pace. He was the newest member of their underground collective, barely 20 years old, with an athletic build that had allowed him to adapt quickly to tunnel life, both figuratively and literally. Robert had fit in remarkably well with their community from the moment he arrived, his natural kindness and positive attitude helping to brighten the often harsh realities of their underground existence. But his most valuable asset was his speed. He was easily the fastest person on two legs in their entire community, making him the perfect choice to serve as a messenger between the various residential areas spread throughout the tunnel system. "Slow down, Robert. Is everything okay?" Diesel asked with concern as the young man approached. Robert took a moment to catch his breath and gather himself, though the fear in his eyes was clearly visible even in the dim light of their lantern. "You have to come quick. Something is really wrong with Bobby." Chapter 4. The group stared at Robert with growing concern, trying to understand the urgency behind his warning. Both Nathan and Fiona tensed up visibly, their minds racing back to the horrific encounter with the blood-soaked creatures they had faced on the streets just a short time earlier. The memory of those vacant, predatory eyes and the savage way they had torn into their victim was still fresh in their minds. "Robert, calm down, boy. What's going on?" Diesel asked. "I don't know Diesel. He was just starting to get really quiet while I was sitting with him. Then he started convulsing," Robert explained, his words tumbling out in a rush of anxiety and confusion. "Follow me," Diesel commanded, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had served him well during his years in the army. Diesel picked up the pace considerably, leading the group as they moved swiftly through the maze of concrete tunnels that comprised their underground home. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the curved walls as they navigated the familiar passages, making several sharp turns before finally stopping outside of Bobby's makeshift living space. They could hear movement coming from inside the small alcove, but the sounds were completely unlike anything Bobby would normally make. Bobby was known throughout their community as a quiet, bookish individual who spent most of his time reading salvaged paperbacks by the light of a small camping lantern. What they were hearing now sounded more like someone was frantically trying to teach themselves how to dance, with erratic movements and occasional thumping against the walls. Diesel stepped up to approach the entrance, which was unusually wide open with no tarp or barrier covering it. This was highly unusual, as Bobby typically valued his privacy and always kept some form of covering across his doorway. Before Diesel could announce his presence, Vernon reached out and grabbed his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. While Diesel was physically larger and held the leadership position within their community, he had learned to defer to Vernon in situations where physical confrontation might be required. It wasn't about ego or hierarchy. It was about making Vernon feel valued and useful, which was something that most of the people living in the tunnels desperately needed for their psychological well-being. Vernon stepped up to the entrance, clearing his throat before calling out in his most non-threatening voice. "Hey, Bobby, it's Vernon. I'm just here to check on..." Vernon began. Before Vernon could finish his sentence, a zombified version of Bobby came rushing out of the opening like a wild animal, drawn to the sound of human voices. The sound of excited moaning echoed throughout the cavernous space as the creature emerged from the darkness, its movements jerky and unnatural. Vernon's large frame blocked most of the light coming from Diesel's lantern, creating shadows that made it difficult for him to see exactly what was approaching. Before he could get a clear look at what Bobby had become, the creature was already latched onto his forearm with its teeth, biting down with tremendous force. "Son of a bitch!" Vernon yelled out in pain and surprise. Vernon began swinging his arm from side to side in a desperate attempt to dislodge the creature from his flesh. After a moment of violent struggle, he managed to grab onto the zombie's throat with his free hand, using his considerable strength to yank it away from his body. However, the ghoul kept its teeth firmly clamped on his flesh, ripping away a substantial chunk of meat as it was forcibly removed. The zombie flew through the air from the force of Vernon's throw, tumbling over the edge of the walkway and falling several feet down into the central drainage channel that ran through the middle of the tunnel system. Vernon dropped to one knee, gripping his injury tightly while muttering a steady stream of curses under his breath. Diesel quickly adjusted his lantern so that it was shining down toward the creature below, illuminating the concrete channel that was approximately 8 feet below their current position. The group looked on in horror as they got their first clear view of what their friend Bobby had become. The thing that had once been a gentle, book-loving member of their community was now a snarling, blood-covered monster with vacant eyes and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "I told you something was wrong with him," Robert exclaimed, vindicated but horrified by the confirmation of his fears. "Yeah, you ain't kidding, boy," Vernon replied, holding up his injured arm to emphasize the severity of the situation. "Fiona, Nathan, did those people who attacked you act like that?" Diesel asked, connecting the dots between the two incidents. "Yeah, they did," Nathan confirmed grimly. Diesel stared down at the ghoul that had once been their friend and neighbor, watching as it focused its attention upward with single-minded intensity. The creature reached up repeatedly in a futile attempt to grab the fresh meal that was tantalizingly just beyond its reach. After several long moments, someone yelled out from a distant section of the tunnel system, and the sound drew the zombies' attention away from their group. In a flash, the creature took off running toward the source of the new noise, its damaged leg causing it to move with an awkward but still frightening gait as it vanished into the darkness of the tunnels. "Jesus Christ," Nathan whispered, still processing what they had just witnessed. Diesel's military training kicked in as he realized that whether he wanted it or not, he was now commanding a mission in a war zone. He began issuing orders with the kind of authority that made people obey without question, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with unmistakable command presence. "Robert, you need to get moving. Start warning everybody you can that we have a serious problem down here," Diesel ordered. "What in the hell do I tell them?" Robert asked. "Whatever you have to, in order to get them to protect themselves. Now go," Diesel commanded. Robert nodded and began running in the opposite direction from where the zombie had disappeared, his athletic frame allowing him to cover ground quickly as he vanished around a corner to spread the warning throughout their underground community. "Vernon, how's that arm?" Diesel asked, turning his attention to the injured man. "That bastard messed me up pretty good, but I can still do what needs to be done," Vernon replied through gritted teeth, trying to project strength despite his obvious pain. Diesel directed the lantern light toward Vernon's wound, immediately seeing blood pouring out at an alarming rate. The bite had torn through muscle and possibly damaged major blood vessels. He shook his head with concern before looking over at Fiona. "Has that pharmacist friend of yours given you anything that could patch that up?" Diesel asked. "It won't be perfect, but I think I can get the bleeding to stop," Fiona replied, mentally inventorying the medical supplies they had obtained. "Good, get it done," Diesel said decisively. "Damn it, Diesel, I said I was fine." Vernon protested, his pride making him resistant to being sidelined. "You're going to bleed out in about 15 minutes, and you're no use to me in that condition," Diesel replied bluntly. "Now shut your mouth and go get patched up. Once you do, come find me, because we have work to do." Vernon reluctantly nodded, understanding that Diesel was right, even though he didn't like being forced to acknowledge his limitations. Fiona reached out and grabbed his uninjured arm, gently but firmly guiding him in the direction of her living space, where she kept her medical supplies. "So, what do we do?" Nathan asked, looking to Diesel for leadership. "We're hunting that thing down. Come on," Diesel replied. Diesel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small backup flashlight, handing it over to Nathan before leading them deeper into the tunnel system. They reached the next major intersection, where the sounds of screams and inhuman moaning echoed off every concrete surface, creating a cacophony of terror that seemed to come from all directions. They stood motionless for several tense moments, trying to determine the source of the various sounds and identify which direction posed the most immediate threat. After a moment, a woman's terrified scream cut through the other noises, and Diesel's expression became focused with recognition. "That's Sally. She's this way. Come on," Diesel said with urgency. The two men made a sharp turn into the next tunnel section, which was smaller in diameter than the main passages, and didn't have the central drainage channel running through the middle. However, it did feature a concrete ramp that provided access from the lower channel level, allowing anyone an easy-to-navigate path to the main level. They raced into the oppressive darkness, their meager flashlight beams doing little to penetrate the black void that surrounded them. Sally's screams continued to echo from somewhere ahead, growing more desperate and terrified with each passing second. The duo finally got close enough for their combined light to illuminate the horrific scene that awaited them, and they stopped dead in their tracks when they saw two zombies viciously tearing into Sally's motionless body on the concrete floor. The creatures were feeding with animalistic intensity, blood covering their faces and hands as they consumed their victim. Both ghouls stopped their feeding when the flashlight beams hit them, slowly turning their heads in the direction of the new arrivals. A tense standoff ensued for several seconds, with the zombies acting like deer caught in headlights before their predatory instincts kicked in and they leaped away from their fresh kill. "Watch yourself!" Diesel shouted. Diesel instinctively pushed Nathan backward, positioning himself between the younger man and the two rampaging zombies, who were approximately 15 yards away and closing the distance rapidly. However, before the creatures could reach them, Nathan suddenly yanked the bright camping lantern out of Diesel's grip. "What are you doing?" Diesel demanded, confused by Nathan's actions. Nathan turned and sprinted back the way they had come, yelling at the top of his lungs while taking all the light with him, leaving Diesel in complete darkness. "Take care of Sally. I'll meet you at your spot," Nathan called back over his shoulder. Diesel quickly stepped to the side and pressed himself against the tunnel wall, becoming completely invisible in the darkness as the two zombies rushed past him in pursuit of the moving light and noise. He remained motionless until he heard their footsteps and moaning fade around the next corner, then pulled out another small flashlight and clicked it on. He directed the beam toward where Sally lay on the ground, her body torn and bloodied from the savage attack. By the time he reached her side and knelt down to check for any signs of life, it was clear that she was already gone. "I'm sorry, Sally. I really am," Diesel said quietly, his voice heavy with grief and guilt. Diesel stood up and began walking quickly back toward his living area. As he turned the corner, he heard movement coming from behind him in the direction he had just left. Diesel tensed up and pulled the flashlight against his chest to conceal his position, listening carefully to identify the source of the sound. He could hear someone or something getting up from the ground, followed by the distinctive moaning sound they had come to associate with the infected, and then the sound of running footsteps moving in the opposite direction. "Tell me that wasn't what I think it is," Diesel muttered to himself with dread. Diesel carefully shined his light back toward the spot where Sally's body had been lying just moments before, only to find nothing remaining except a large pool of blood on the concrete floor. "Damn it!" he cursed under his breath, realizing that their situation had just become significantly more complicated. While Diesel was coming to terms with the horrifying reality of what they were dealing with, Nathan was running for his life through the labyrinthine tunnel system. He continued yelling as he moved, deliberately maintaining the attention of the two creatures pursuing him while trying to lead them away from the other residents. He reached the next major intersection, where one of the large central drainage channels crossed beneath the walkway. Without slowing down, he cut hard to the right, knowing from his familiarity with the tunnel layout that there was another channel intersection approximately 50 yards ahead. "Yeah, this way," Nathan shouted, extending the lantern to make sure the two creatures were still following him. He caught a brief glimpse of the zombies in the circle of light, their blood-stained faces and vacant eyes confirming that they were indeed still in pursuit. The sight was enough to send a fresh surge of adrenaline through his system, and he began running even faster through the darkness. Nathan pumped his legs as hard as they would go, keeping the lantern beam focused ahead so he could see where the walkway ended and avoid running off the edge into the drainage channel. The thunderous sound of zombie footsteps mixed with their excited moaning, creating a soundtrack of terror that kept him motivated to maintain his desperate pace. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the intersection where another drainage channel cut across into the main one, creating a gap that was too wide to simply step across. Nathan let out a primal yell as he planted his foot at the edge and pushed off with everything he had, launching himself through the air toward the other side. Nathan soared through the darkness, reaching out desperately for the opposite edge as it rushed toward him. He landed hard against the steep concrete incline on the far side, his stomach catching the edge while his legs dangled over the channel below. Nathan extended his arms and planted them firmly on the textured concrete surface, using the friction to stop his slide toward the bottom of the channel. The concrete had just enough roughness to allow him to grip it and pull himself up to safety, though the effort left him breathless and sore. He had barely managed to get both feet on solid ground when he heard two distinct thudding sounds coming from the bottom of the channel below. Nathan quickly popped up to his feet and shined the lantern down into the drainage area, revealing the two zombies that had been pursuing him lying at the bottom. "I knew you bastards weren't that smart," Nathan called down to them with a mixture of relief and vindication. One of the creatures had landed headfirst on the concrete floor, the impact snapping its neck and rendering it truly lifeless. The other zombie, however, was still upright despite having landed awkwardly and suffering what appeared to be a clean break in one of its legs. Despite the severe injury that would have incapacitated any living person, the creature remained mobile and showed no signs of pain or distress from its condition. "That's interesting," Nathan observed. Nathan took a moment to catch his breath and assess his own condition, rubbing some of the soreness out of his stomach where he had impacted the concrete edge. Once he felt ready to continue, he began making his way back through the tunnels toward Diesel's living area. "I gotta get back to Diesel." Chapter 5. Ice sat in the corner of her makeshift living space, a small camping light providing just enough illumination for her to make out the words on the pages of her book. The paperback novel was well worn from countless readings, with visible water damage along the edges, a common condition for books in their underground environment where moisture was a constant enemy of paper and fabric. She was trying her best to focus on the story, a standard medieval romance featuring a shirtless male model on the cover who was supposed to represent the dashing hero of the tale. Usually these types of escapist stories were exactly what she needed to keep her mind occupied and transport her away from the harsh realities of tunnel life. But tonight was different, with so many people in their community suffering from the mysterious illness that had been spreading through their population. It was proving difficult to concentrate on fictional problems when real ones were so close at hand. After reading the same paragraph 3 times without retaining any of the information, she finally tossed the book down in frustration, the sound of it hitting the concrete floor echoing in the small space. "You're too good of a story to give up on, so I'll try you again tomorrow. It's just not happening tonight," Ice said to the book, as if it were a friend who would understand her distraction. She picked the paperback back up and carefully placed it on top of a short stack of similar novels resting on a plastic storage container that she was using as a makeshift nightstand. The container held her most precious possessions, a few changes of clothes, personal hygiene items, and her small collection of books. Ice looked around her living space for something else that might keep her mind occupied during the long hours of the night. Her eyes settled on a deck of playing cards that sat on another improvised piece of furniture, and she reached over to grab them with renewed purpose. "A little solitaire never hurt anybody," she said to herself, needing to hear a human voice even if it was her own. Ice reached over and grabbed another plastic storage bin, pulling it closer to her seat so she would have a flat surface for playing cards. She shuffled the worn deck with the practiced movements of someone who had spent countless hours playing cards, both for entertainment and occasionally for small stakes when the mood struck the tunnel community. She began dealing out the cards for a game of solitaire, but stopped abruptly when she heard loud moaning coming from somewhere down the tunnel system. The sound carried through the concrete passages, amplified and distorted by the acoustics of their underground environment. The noise struck her as strange, but she shook off her concern, knowing that unusual sounds were unfortunately common in their subterranean home. Not everyone who ended up living in the tunnels was as mentally stable as she was, and sometimes people simply had emotional breakdowns or episodes that resulted in disturbing vocalizations. However, as the moaning picked up in intensity and was joined by the sound of running footsteps echoing through the tunnels, she began to realize that what she was hearing wasn't part of the normal range of disturbances they occasionally experienced. Ice grabbed a small flashlight from her makeshift nightstand, clicking it on as she stood up and walked over to the entrance of her living space. Her doorway was covered by a blue plastic tarp, and she carefully pulled it back just enough to peer out into the main tunnel. She let out a panicked yelp as a figure came rushing toward her position through the darkness, but her fear quickly turned to relief when she realized it was Robert. "Christ, man, you scared," Ice began, but before she could finish her sentence, Robert reached out and put his hand firmly over her mouth. Under normal circumstances, Ice would have immediately smacked anyone who dared to put their hands on her without permission. But the unmistakable fear in Robert's eyes convinced her to restrain her defensive instincts and listen to what he had to say. "What's wrong?" Ice mumbled through his hand, prompting him to remove it from her mouth. "Be quiet and get inside," Robert whispered urgently. The sounds of moaning and thundering footfalls continued to echo through the tunnels behind Robert's position, and the noise appeared to be getting closer with each passing second. Ice stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening, but Robert didn't give her time to think as he gently but firmly pushed her back into her living space. She stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance as Robert rushed in behind her and grabbed the blue tarp that had been hanging above the entrance. He yanked it down from its mounting points and dragged it over to where she was standing, his movements quick and desperate. "What are you doing?" Ice asked in confusion. Robert held his finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, trying to get her to quiet down before whatever was pursuing him could locate their position. Much to his relief, she understood the gravity of the situation and remained silent as the sounds of approaching creatures grew louder. Robert grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the mattress that served as her bed, collapsing beside her on the thin foam padding. He yanked the plastic tarp over both of their heads like a makeshift tent, before reaching over and clicking off her flashlight, plunging them into complete darkness. A moment later, the sounds of inhuman moaning filled her living space, bouncing off the concrete walls and creating an acoustic nightmare that terrified them both. They could hear the creatures moving around the area with erratic, uncoordinated movements, stumbling into furniture and walls as they tried to locate the source of the human scents and sounds they had detected. Ice started to tremble uncontrollably, but found some measure of calm when Robert reached over and took her hand in his, providing human contact in the midst of their terror. He gave her hand several gentle squeezes, trying to keep her calm and grounded, but his efforts had limited effect as the creatures continued their chaotic search through her belongings. The zombies moved erratically through the small space, knocking over containers and personal items as they stumbled around in the near-total darkness. Despite her best efforts to remain perfectly still, Ice couldn't help but flinch when one of the creatures knocked over her makeshift nightstand, sending her precious books and camping lantern clattering to the concrete floor with a series of loud crashes. The sudden noise and movement drew the attention of one of the ghouls, which turned its vacant gaze toward the tarp that was concealing them. As the zombie began moving in their direction, a terrified scream echoed throughout the tunnel system from somewhere else in the complex. The sound was enough to get the attention of the second creature, which darted back out into the darkness in search of this new potential prey. However, the other zombie remained focused on the tarp, beginning to paw at the plastic material like a curious cat trying to find a bug hidden underneath a blanket. Robert maintained a firm grip on Ice's hand, doing everything he could to keep her calm and prevent her from panicking, but his efforts were undermined when the zombie managed to grab onto her leg through the thin plastic barrier. The unexpected contact caused her to let out a scream and bounce up from her seated position, trying desperately to get away from the ghoul's grasping hands. The zombie let out an excited moan as it finally locked onto its prey, reaching out with both hands to grab onto her wrist as she tried to flee from the confined space. The creature's grip was surprisingly strong, and it yanked her back into the living area with enough force to nearly knock her off her feet. "Help me! Help me!" Ice cried out desperately. Robert sprang into action, bounding up from his position on the mattress and stumbling over the tarp as he reached out for the attacking creature. He managed to regain his footing quickly before bringing both of his arms down hard over the top of the zombie's head, using gravity and momentum to maximize the impact of his strike. Despite his relatively small frame, Robert managed to break the creature's grasp on Ice's wrist, though the ghoul immediately began bucking and thrashing like a wild bronco, trying to throw off a rider. Robert knew he wouldn't be able to maintain his grip on the powerful, struggling creature for very long, so he quickly pivoted and used the zombie's own momentum to throw it toward the opposite side of the small room. The creature hit the concrete wall with a solid thud, but didn't take long to regain its footing, turning around and rushing back toward the two humans with renewed aggression. Robert reacted swiftly, grabbing the plastic tarp from the bed and throwing it up in front of himself like a makeshift net. The zombie ran directly into the plastic sheeting at full speed, allowing Robert to wrap his arms around both the creature and the tarp. The material covered the entirety of the attacker, preventing it from being able to bite him while he maintained his hold. He gripped the improvised restraint with everything he had, keeping the tarp firmly in place around the struggling zombie. "Do you have any rope?" Robert asked through gritted teeth. Ice's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for rope or anything else that might serve as a binding material. Their living spaces weren't exactly well stocked with hardware supplies, so she had to think creatively about what might be available. Her gaze eventually fell upon a pair of jeans that had been discarded in the corner of the room. She darted over and grabbed the denim pants, wrapping them around the midsection of the creature and tying the legs together to keep the tarp securely in place around the zombie's torso and head. Once she was clear of the struggling ghoul, Robert gave the creature a forceful shove, sending it toppling to the concrete floor. They both watched nervously as it struggled to get back up, but the makeshift restraints were effective enough to prevent it from standing or moving in any coordinated fashion. "Robert, what the hell is going on?" Ice asked, her voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. "Something is happening to the sick people. They're going crazy," Robert explained, still catching his breath from the struggle. "What do we do?" Ice asked, looking to him for guidance. "We need to get to Diesel's spot. He'll know what to do," Robert replied with confidence in their leader's ability to handle the crisis. Ice nodded in agreement, following Robert toward the exit of her living space, but she grabbed his hand before he could get too far ahead of her. "What is it?" Robert asked, turning back to face her. "We have to warn Wanda," Ice said with conviction. Robert thought about her suggestion for a moment, his survival instincts telling him to get to Diesel as quickly as possible, but he knew that Ice was absolutely right about their responsibility to protect the older woman who had become like a grandmother to many of them. He stepped in front of Ice, pulling out a small flashlight from his pocket, but keeping the beam pointed low toward the ground to minimize their visibility to any creatures that might be lurking in the tunnels. "Come on, let's move," Robert said quietly. Robert led them down the tunnel, pausing at each intersection to listen carefully for signs of trouble before proceeding. He could hear the distant sounds of moaning and screaming echoing throughout their underground home, but nothing sounded particularly close to their current position. With a cautious nod, he led them through the next few turns in the tunnel system before they reached the area near Wanda's living space, which was located close to the main entrance. They moved quickly but quietly to her doorway, pushing through the colorful bead curtain that served as her entrance. "I know there's not a door there, but you can say knock knock," Wanda said with gentle reproach from her position on a collection of cushions and blankets. "I'm sorry, Wanda, there's no time," Robert replied urgently. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Wanda asked, sensing the tension in the young man's voice. Robert looked around her living space and spotted a large, heavy quilt folded in one corner of the room. He grabbed the bedding while Ice moved over to help Wanda get positioned on her sleeping area. "There are some people acting crazy in here, Wanda, so you're going to need to hide," Ice explained as gently as possible. "Oh, who would want to hurt me?" Wanda asked with the innocent confusion of someone who had always been protected by her community. "These people will. They're not thinking right in the head," Ice replied, allowing the fear in her voice to convey the seriousness of the situation. Wanda could hear the terror in Ice's voice, so she decided to trust the younger woman's judgment and comply with their instructions. She got into position on her bed, allowing them to help her prepare for whatever was coming. Robert walked over with the heavy quilt, carefully laying it on top of Wanda's small frame to provide both concealment and warmth during what might be a long period of hiding. "If you hear anything that isn't someone calling your name, you pull this over your head and stay quiet. Okay?" Robert instructed. Wanda nodded her understanding, even though she didn't fully comprehend exactly what kind of danger they were all facing. "We'll be back as soon as we can," Ice promised. "Be safe, honey," Wanda replied with maternal concern. Ice nodded and pulled the comforter over Wanda's head, ensuring that the older woman was completely concealed beneath the protective covering. "Okay, Robert, let's get to Diesel's spot." Chapter 6. Vernon winced as Fiona pulled back a bloody portion of t-shirt that he had been using to try and slow the blood loss. She grabbed the small flashlight off of her bed, shining it onto the wound to make sure all of the fabric was coming off. "Can you go a little easy there?" Vernon asked. "Oh, stop being a big baby," Fiona said. Vernon chuckled despite the pain at Fiona's jab. He went back to groaning as she grabbed onto another piece of broken-off fabric, pulling it out of the wound with careful but firm movements. The makeshift bandage had done little more than trap debris in the injury, creating a mess that needed to be thoroughly cleaned before any real treatment could begin. "There we go. All of that nasty fabric is gone. Maybe next time you'll listen to me when I say that you shouldn't do something," Fiona said. "Yeah, well, I thought it was more important to stop the blood pouring out of me than putting something clean on there," Vernon replied. "And how did that work out for you?" Fiona asked. Fiona shined the flashlight on the wound, which was still bleeding steadily despite Vernon's earlier attempts at self-treatment. The bite marks were deep and ragged, showing the full extent of damage that the creature's teeth had inflicted on his forearm. "Fair point," Vernon said. Fiona reached over to her bed, where a small medical kit was sitting among her other belongings. She opened it up, rummaging around for antiseptic, while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds echoing through the tunnel system. As she looked through the supplies that Oliver had provided over the months, a couple more screams could be heard coming from down the tunnels. Vernon perked up at the distant cries for help, beginning to get to his feet before Fiona grabbed his hand, keeping him down on the makeshift seat they had fashioned from storage containers. "Fiona, this can wait. I need to get out there," Vernon said. "You need to sit your ass down and let me clean this," Fiona replied. "I told you it can wait," Vernon said, "and I told you that it can't. It'll take me 2 minutes, and believe me when I say it's necessary," Fiona said. Vernon reluctantly complied with Fiona's demand, sitting back down and letting her apply the antiseptic to his wound. He knew from experience that arguing with her when she was in this kind of mood was generally a losing proposition, and the pain from his injury was starting to make him feel lightheaded anyway. The burly man let out a yelp as the liquid hit his injury, causing him to yank his arm back instinctively before Fiona could grab it and hold it steady. "Damn, girl, what the hell is in that stuff?" Vernon asked. "You don't need to worry about that. Just let it do its thing," Fiona said. "I still don't get why you're being such a hard ass. I've had worse injuries in my life," Vernon said. "Have you ever been bitten?" Fiona asked. "I can't say that I have," Vernon replied. "Then you don't know what you're talking about," Fiona said. Fiona's tone was curt and abrasive, completely off character for her normally warm and caring personality. Vernon noticed the change in her demeanor, recognizing that something was off. "I'm sorry if I touched a nerve there, Fiona," Vernon said. Fiona paused as she wrapped the injury, clearly overcome with emotion, before shaking it off and continuing with her work. "I had a friend of mine a few years back. He was stubborn and hard-headed just like you. Well, maybe even a level above you since you actually listened to me," Fiona said. Vernon let out a chuckle, putting her more at ease as she continued working on his bandages. "We were out dumpster diving one night when a wild dog got jealous of our find. He put himself between us and got a nasty bite as a reward. I begged him to go get it treated, but he was too manly to do it," Fiona continued. Fiona paused in her work, shaking her head at the memory of her friend's stubborn refusal to seek proper medical attention. "Needless to say, it became infected. By the time I convinced him to go get it looked at, it was too late. They had to amputate," she said. Vernon tensed up at the mention of amputation, suddenly much more worried about his own condition. "I'm sorry," Vernon said. "It's okay, Vernon. At least you were smart enough to listen to me," Fiona replied. Fiona put the finishing touches on wrapping the injury, using medical tape from Oliver's supplies to secure the bandages before giving the big man a pat on the leg. "There you go, good as new," she said. "Thank you, Vernon began. Vernon trailed off as they heard a low moan coming from somewhere close by. Both of them froze in place, listening intently as the shuffling footsteps got closer to Fiona's living space. A moment later, a zombie wandered past the opening, which was blocked by a plastic tarp that acted as her door. Fiona reacted on instinct, reaching over and grabbing the light from her makeshift nightstand, trying to dim the brightness that might attract unwanted attention. In doing so, she accidentally rattled some things around, knocking over a small container and causing the creature to rush inside the living space. Vernon reacted swiftly, leaping to his feet despite his injury to meet the creature head-on. He wrapped his powerful arms around the midsection of the ghoul before spinning around it in a deft wrestling maneuver that utilized his years of experience working as a bouncer. "Back up," Vernon commanded. Fiona did as instructed, scrambling backward to give him room to work while staying close enough to help if needed. He tightened his arms around the creature's waist before lifting it up and driving it head first into the concrete floor with tremendous force. An audible crack filled the space, causing them both to wince at the sickening sound of bone-meeting concrete. They watched the creature convulse on the ground for several seconds before falling completely quiet and motionless. For good measure, Vernon gave it a light kick in the side, making sure it was down for the count. Before either of them could speak or catch their breath, they heard more moaning coming from outside in the tunnel. Vernon motioned for Fiona to come over by him, both of them pressing their backs against the wall and remaining as quiet as possible while listening to the sounds from the tunnel system. They remained silent and motionless as the ghouls wandered by the opening to Fiona's living space, only to take off running when they heard someone call out for help from deeper down the tunnels. They stood there without moving for several moments, making sure they were truly alone before daring to speak. "We need to get over to Diesel's spot," Vernon said. "Let me get the flashlights," Fiona replied. Fiona walked over to her bed, grabbing a handful of small flashlights from her collection of supplies. Pushing a couple into her back pocket before handing one over to Vernon, she clicked the last remaining one on in her hand, keeping the beam pointed low to avoid attracting attention. "I'm following you," Fiona said. "Stay close and quiet," Vernon instructed. Vernon moved over to the entrance, freezing in place when he heard movement coming from just outside the tarp barrier. He readied himself for another fight, tensing his muscles and preparing to defend them both, but relaxed when he heard a familiar and friendly voice. "Fiona, are you in there?" Robert called out. "Robert, are you okay?" Fiona replied. Robert stepped into her living space, with Ice following close behind him. Both of them looked down at the zombie's body laying motionless on the ground, neither of them wanting to get too close to the creature that had recently been one of their neighbors. "Is it dead?" Ice asked. "Yeah, he's down for the count," Vernon said. "How did you manage that?" Robert asked. "Pile driving it head first into the concrete seems to do the trick," Vernon explained. "That would be useful information if I had the strength to lift one of them off the ground," Robert said. "We're headed over to Diesel's spot," Fiona announced. "So are we," Ice said. Everyone tensed up as more screams and moans echoed throughout the darkness, the sounds bouncing off the concrete walls and creating an ominous atmosphere. "We're going to be moving fast, so keep up," Vernon warned. The group nodded their understanding as Vernon led them out into the tunnels. They moved as a single unit, lining up one after another behind their leader, as he navigated through the familiar passages that had become significantly more dangerous in the span of just a few hours. While the sounds of pain and terror bounced off the tunnel walls around them, they all appeared to be coming from areas far away from their current position. It took several minutes for them to get close to Diesel's living space, slowing down their pace as they approached the area. They could hear movement coming from inside Diesel's space, along with someone cursing under their breath in what sounded like frustration or anger. Vernon held up his hand, getting the others to stay put, while he moved forward to inspect the situation. Vernon took a deep breath to steady himself before jumping out from cover. He quickly relaxed when he saw Diesel standing over the bodies of two zombies, who were motionless on the ground. The leader of their group was gripping a bloody screwdriver in his hand. "Damn, Diesel, are you all right?" Vernon asked. "Yeah, I'm good, Vernon," Diesel replied. The group filtered into Diesel's living space, each of them gasping at the sight of their former friends and neighbors laying dead on the ground. The reality of what had happened to their community was becoming more apparent with each encounter. "My God, what happened?" Robert asked. "They heard me digging around in here, so I had to put them down," Diesel explained. "Hitting the head?" Vernon asked. Diesel looked down at his bloody screwdriver before nodding slightly. "Yeah, that was the only thing that did the trick," Diesel confirmed. Everyone tensed up as running footfalls reached their ears, getting closer to their position. They relaxed once Nathan appeared in the entryway, breathing heavily from his sprint through the tunnel system. "The head, you gotta hit them in the—" Nathan began. Nathan trailed off as he saw the two bodies on the ground, realizing that his urgent message had already been discovered and acted upon. "Well, it's a good thing I ran all the way here, or else you might not have figured that out," Nathan said. Diesel marched over to the young man, staring him down for a moment before reaching out and grabbing him by the shirt. He pulled him in tight, getting nose to nose with him in a confrontation that surprised everyone in the group. "If you ever pull something like that again, I will beat your ass," Diesel warned. Nathan raised the lantern up so that Diesel could see it clearly. "For what it's worth, I didn't damage it too much," Nathan said. Diesel remained intense for another moment before cracking a smile and letting go of Nathan's shirt. "That was a ballsy move, I'll give you that," Diesel said. "Sorry, Big D, I just reacted on instinct and hauled ass," Nathan replied. "Well, I hope you didn't tire yourself out, because I have a plan on how to deal with all this, and you're going to need your legs." Chapter 7. Vernon stood by the entrance to Diesel's spot, holding a crowbar in his hand that he had retrieved from their leader's collection of tools. He stayed behind a blanket that was hung up to conceal the group from any wandering creatures, but listened intently to what was happening beyond in the tunnels. The sounds of moaning and movement continued to echo through the concrete passages, though they seemed to be coming from areas deeper in the tunnel system rather than their current location. The rest of the group gathered around Diesel, who stood against the back wall of his living space. Nathan, Robert, Ice, and Fiona looked to their leader, ready to hear what his plan to deal with their crisis was. Each of them carried the weight of exhaustion and fear on their faces, but there was also a sense of hope that came from having someone with military experience taking charge of their desperate situation. Okay, I think it's safe to say we're in some deep shit here, so we're gonna have to take some risks to come out the other side in one piece, Diesel said. The group nodded to him as they continued to listen, hanging on every word as he laid out their strategy for survival. First off, Ice, please tell me you secured the maintenance entrance, Diesel said. Yeah, it's locked up tight. Well, mostly tight, Ice replied. Mostly tight? Diesel asked. Yeah, I put the padlock through the chains but didn't fasten it. Wanda didn't know where the key was, and I didn't want to leave us trapped in here, Ice explained. That's okay because I don't think these things are all that bright, Nathan said. What do you mean? Ice asked. I mean, when Nathan and I climbed under the fence at the warehouse, they didn't try to do the same. They just pressed up against it, like they were trying to push through it, Fiona said. And the ones who were chasing after me just ran straight into the drainage channel after I jumped it. They just seem to lock on and run after whoever they have in their sights, Nathan added. Which is what I'm counting on, Diesel said. I'm pretty sure Nathan and I can get them running after us, but where in the world are we going to take them? Robert asked. The main drainage channel, the one that leads out to the reservoir, Diesel replied. The group exchanged some looks before their leader's rationale began to set in. I like it. It rained pretty hard here a couple of nights ago, right? Nathan asked. Yeah, the internal reservoir is about half full, so not quite enough to trip the automatic release, which means someone is going to have to get up there to trip it, Robert said. You leave that to me. That manual release wheel is a bitch to move, Diesel said. I can come help you out with it, Vernon offered. Diesel shook his head no, resisting the initial urge to point to his friend's injury. Instead, he took a more judicious approach that wouldn't wound Vernon's pride while still keeping him safe. I need you doing something else, something vital if this plan is going to work, Diesel said. What is it? Vernon asked. That center channel has a lot of feeder lines, and the last time those city workers came down here, they left several of the gates open, Diesel explained. I would complain about them not doing their jobs, but they leave us alone, so I can't really say much, Vernon said. Well, they've passed their responsibility on to you, Ice and Fiona. I need the three of you down there getting those gates closed. Because if we're going to clear these things out, I don't want to risk any of them staying behind, Diesel said. I can handle it on my own, Diesel, Vernon said. I'm sure you can, but we're going to help, Ice replied. There's got to be 15 of those gates, and it's going to go a lot faster with 3 of us, Fiona added. Vernon looked at the 2 women staring him down with expressions that made it clear they weren't going to take no for an answer, prompting him to let out a laugh. Well, I'm already injured. I don't think I need an ass beating by the 2 of you on top of it, Vernon said. Damn right you don't, Ice said. There were some light laughs in the spot before Nathan spoke up, breaking the momentary levity that had helped ease some of the tension in the group. So what are Robert and I going to do? Nathan asked. Well, remember how I said you're going to need your legs? Diesel replied. Yeah, Nathan said. We're the bait, Robert said. Nathan thought about it for a moment before dropping his head in resignation as the reality of their role in the plan became clear. Yeah, that makes sense. What are you thinking? Nathan asked. Diesel grabbed a waterlogged notebook off the ground, flipping through it before finding a dry page that he could use for sketching. He pulled out a pencil stub and began drawing a rough diagram of the area they were dealing with. The center portion of the drawing was the maze of tunnels that they resided in, which crisscrossed one another and stretched out from the center channel that cut through the heart of it. He added details showing the various residential areas and connection points that made up their underground community. On either side of the central area sat an outer loop tunnel that went in a semicircle from the exterior wall at the entrance all the way around to the top part of the central area. It connected at the base of the internal reservoir, with a giant gap between the 2 halves where the water would flow. The outer loop had multiple connection points leading into the central area, as well as drains that fed down from the streets above. Diesel marked each of these entry points with small X marks to show the routes that the creatures might use. The two of you are going to be the ones to lure those things to the central channel, Diesel said. I know a lot of running is going to be involved, but how exactly are we supposed to do that? Nathan asked. I'm going to need you to get to the outer loop and start making as much noise. With any luck, they'll be smart enough to find their way to you and follow you right into the central channel, Diesel explained. Nathan began nodding, understanding the plan as it came together in his mind. The strategy was risky, but they didn't have much in the way of options. And we just have to jump over the gap and let them fall in, Nathan said. You don't even have to jump all the way over. There's a ledge on the wall that runs over the gap. Jump up there, have a seat, and enjoy your front row seat to the great flood, Diesel said. Do we even know if drowning is going to kill these things? Ice asked. When they get hit with that wall of water, they're going to be dragged across the concrete for half a mile, so there should be a lot of head trauma by the time they get outside, Diesel replied. And even if there's not, it's a good 10-15-foot drop into the reservoir from the drainage pipe, so it's not like they'll be able to get back up here, Robert added. Ice and Fiona nodded at the answer, finding it satisfactory enough to proceed with the dangerous plan. So, how do you want us to signal you once we got them in position? Nathan asked. You won't be able to. That valve release room is deep in the tunnels. We're just going to have to go off a timer, Diesel said. Will 30 minutes be enough time? Robert asked. I wouldn't want to do it any longer than that. Even if those gates are closed, there are ramps that they can take back up if they lose interest in us, Nathan said. 30 minutes will be just fine, Diesel said. Diesel looked down at his wrist to a well-worn digital watch that had served him faithfully through his military service and years of tunnel life. He clicked on a 30-minute timer before looking back to the others with an expression of grim resolve. You get going? I'm going to be right behind you. And good luck, Diesel said. The group nodded to him as they turned and followed Vernon out from the spot. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly as they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel system, each of them carrying the weight of responsibility for their community's survival. Once they were gone, Diesel walked over to the corner of the space, pulling a few boxes down before digging in one at the bottom. The container held various supplies that he had accumulated over his years of living in the tunnels, including some items from his military days that he had hoped never to use again. After a moment, he pulled out a small canvas bag, opening it up to reveal its contents. Inside was a heavy-duty flashlight, several road flares, and a knife with a fixed blade that had seen action in more than one conflict zone. All right, let's get this done. Chapter 8. Vernon, Fiona, and Ice made their way towards the central channel, moving carefully through the tunnel system while staying alert for any signs of the creatures that were roaming through their underground home. They stopped just before reaching a metal ladder near the middle of the main drainage area, taking a moment to look over the task ahead of them and get the lay of the land. There were a couple of solar-powered lights high above in the ceiling, connected to sensors on the road above that detected movement and triggered the illumination system. It wasn't a huge amount of light compared to what they would have preferred, but it was enough for them to see what they were doing without the need of flashlights that might attract unwanted attention. For years, the central channel had been completely dark, making any maintenance work a dangerous proposition in the underground environment. However, the city workers had the lights installed when they were tasked with installing the new drainage gates throughout the tunnel system. The thought of lugging heavy generators and portable lighting equipment in and out of the tunnels every day for weeks on end was just too much for the municipal crews to handle. Vernon spoke in a low tone, not wanting to alert any creatures of where they were until they were done with their job and safely positioned for the next phase of Diesel's plan. Okay, the boys said they're giving us a 10-minute head start, so that should be plenty of time to get this done, Vernon said. Just be careful shutting these gates, because they're heavy, and the latch will make a hell of a racket if you pull it closed too quick, Fiona warned. I'll start on the left on the other side, Ice said. I'll start on the right across the way. Vernon, can you handle this side and we'll pick up what you don't get done? Fiona asked. Sounds like a plan, and once we're done, we get up to the ledge and wait for the boys to do their thing, Vernon said. I still think we'd be better off hiding in one of the spots, Ice said. Me too, but we can't risk making noise that would pull those things away from our runners, Vernon replied. Yeah, you're probably right. I still don't like it though, Ice said. Noted. Now come on, we gotta get this done, Vernon said. Vernon stepped onto the ladder, gripping the metal rungs carefully as he descended to the central channel, 10 feet below. The concrete floor was slightly damp from residual moisture, and he could see the various tunnel openings that fed into the main drainage system. The two women quickly followed, getting to the ground and rushing off to work on their assigned gates. Ice ran down to the left side of the channel, giving the heavy swinging gate a thorough look over before engaging with the mechanism. The metal bars were thick and stained from years of neglect, with rust marks and mineral deposits creating a mottled pattern across the surface. On the right side of the frame was the latch, which was a simple but sturdy metal catch designed to hold the gate securely in place. "This shouldn't be too hard," Ice said. Ice grabbed onto the gate with both hands, straining as she pulled it closed across the tunnel opening. The hinges creaked under the weight of the metal barrier, and when it picked up a little too much momentum, she planted her feet firmly into the ground and put her shoulder into the bars to slow it down. She managed to stop the heavy gate just before it would have slammed shut with a loud crash. Ice stood there for a moment, breathing a sigh of relief at having avoided making the kind of noise that would attract every creature in the tunnel system to their location. "Well, that was almost the dumbest thing you've done all month," Ice said. Ice shook her head at herself before walking over to the next gate, repeating the process with the same careful attention to controlling the noise level. The second gate was slightly smaller, but just as heavy, requiring her to use her full body weight to maneuver it into position. After closing the second gate and securing the latch, she looked up towards Fiona, who had just gotten her second gate closed on the opposite side of the channel. She gave her friend a thumbs up to signal that everything was going according to plan, but their moment of satisfaction was interrupted when a gate behind them slammed shut with tremendous force. The metallic ringing sound echoed throughout the tunnels, a lot louder than any of them were expecting, and carrying much further through the concrete passages than they had hoped. The women turned to look at Vernon, who had an apologetic and worried expression on his face as he realized the mistake he had just made. Within seconds, the unmistakable sounds of excited moaning came at them from down one of the side tunnels, which was quickly followed by the thunderous sound of heavy footfalls as multiple creatures began rushing toward the source of the noise. It took a moment for Vernon to get a read on where the sounds were coming from, but eventually he realized the creatures were approaching from his side of the channel. "Get behind a gate and shut it," Vernon commanded. "But Vernon, we can—" Ice began. Vernon yelled over her in a commanding tone that brooked no argument. "I said get behind a gate," Vernon shouted. Ice and Fiona did as instructed, both of them running to the middle of the row before getting behind the nearest gate and pulling it shut to create a barrier between themselves and whatever was about to emerge from the tunnels. Vernon pulled out the crowbar he had hooked on his belt, gripping it tightly in both hands as he waited for the results of his error to emerge from the darkness. The weapon felt solid and reassuring in his hands, though he knew that facing multiple creatures would be difficult. A moment later, 4 creatures ran out of one of the side tunnels, their blood-covered faces scanning the area as they looked around for the source of the metallic sound that had drawn their attention. Their movements were erratic and predatory, like wild animals searching for prey. One of the creatures looked across the central channel, spotting Ice and Fiona behind their protective gate. It broke out into a sprint, heading in their direction with single-minded focus, stopping only when Vernon smacked his crowbar loudly against the concrete ground. "Hey, assholes! I'm over here!" Vernon yelled. The 4 creatures turned in unison at the sound of his voice, their vacant eyes locking onto him before they rushed in his direction with frightening speed. One ghoul was a few steps ahead of the others, making him an easy target for Vernon's first strike. With a forceful swing, he caught the lead creature in the side of the head with the crowbar, the metal weapon connecting with a sickening crack, fracturing its skull. The zombie dropped to the ground in a lifeless heap, but Vernon barely had time to appreciate his success before the next wave of attackers reached him. He tried to reset his stance in order to strike again, but the next 2 zombies were on him too quickly. One of them grabbed onto his injured arm, causing him to cry out in pain as the creature's grip reopened the wound that Fiona had so carefully bandaged. The other ghoul grabbed onto Vernon's shirt, pulling him in close for a bite. Despite pulling away with all his strength, the creature managed to sink its teeth into flesh, ripping out a substantial chunk from his shoulder and sending fresh blood streaming down his arm. "I'm going to kill you!" Vernon roared. The intense pain sent adrenaline surging through his body, providing him with the strength to push both creatures back away from him. Vernon swung his weapon hard at the nearest target. However, his aim was off due to the pain and blood loss, hitting the zombie in the face rather than the more vulnerable temple area. The impact dislocated the creature's jaw with an audible pop, but did little to deter it from continuing its attack. As the third zombie joined the fray, grabbing at his legs and trying to bring him down, Vernon realized he was about to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. He looked back over his shoulder, seeing an open gate just a few yards away. Vernon knew what he had to do, so he allowed the creatures to get in close enough for him to grab onto them with his powerful arms. As they clawed at him desperately, their teeth sinking into his flesh wherever they could find purchase, he spun them around before pushing off with as much force as his legs could generate. Vernon managed to drive the three creatures back into the side tunnel, pushing them just past the threshold of the gate opening. With as much strength as he could muster despite his injuries, Vernon reached out and grabbed onto the heavy metal frame, using his momentum to fling it shut behind the trapped creatures. The latch clattered loudly when it impacted with the locking mechanism, sealing the zombies inside the tunnel where they could no longer threaten his friends. As the sound of success reached his ears, Vernon shoved the ghouls back just far enough to give himself room to swing his crowbar one final time. This time, his aim was true, hitting the nearest zombie squarely in the side of the head and cracking the skull with enough force to drop it permanently. As the creature collapsed to the ground in a motionless heap, Vernon did the same, slumping forward as the blood continued draining from his multiple wounds. Ice and Fiona stayed behind their protective gate, watching on helplessly as their friend sacrificed himself for their well-being. After a solid minute passed without more creatures joining the fray, Fiona reached down to unlatch the gate that was protecting them. "What are you doing?" Ice asked. "I'm going out there to finish the job," Fiona replied. "But what if more of those things show up?" Ice asked. "More of those things are going to show up when Robert and Nathan bring them here. And if we stay behind the gate, we're going to drown when Diesel opens up the water valve. We have to do this, and we have to do it now," Fiona said. Ice let the words sink in for a moment, realizing that Fiona was absolutely right about their situation, before nodding her agreement. "Okay, let's do it," Ice said. The two women came out from their hiding spot, doing what they could to avoid looking directly at Vernon's motionless form as they moved to complete their mission. They moved swiftly but carefully, pulling the remaining gates closed one by one before returning to the ladder and ascending back to the upper level of the tunnel system. The duo looked down into the channel from their elevated position, trying to put their fallen friend out of their mind and focus on the task that still lay ahead of them. "Come on, let's get to the ledge." Chapter 9. Robert stood at the back wall of the outer loop tunnel, taking a look out through a small porthole. The night air was cool and refreshing, the gentle breeze feeling nice on his face after spending so much time in the stagnant atmosphere of the underground tunnel system. He could hear some kind of commotion in the distance, but couldn't see anything from his limited vantage point. Whatever was happening didn't matter to their current situation, as he was about to run for his life through a gauntlet of creatures that had once been his friends and neighbors. He snapped back into the moment, stretching his legs and arms for a moment before mentally preparing himself for the dangerous sprint ahead. 60 seconds and you're off. Run hard, run fast, and move like the wind, Robert said to himself. Robert kept stretching his muscles as he maintained an internal countdown, knowing that timing would be crucial to the success of Diesel's plan. He looked down the tunnel ahead of him, which was impressively large, stretching 10 feet across from wall to wall. The ceiling was high above his head, a good 10 feet up, with minimal lighting filtering in from the metal grates that connected to the streets above. Every 20 yards or so along his planned route was a pipe opening in the wall to his left, which connected to drainage systems from smaller residential streets throughout the city. The openings were positioned about 8 feet off the ground, and thankfully appeared to be dry rather than carrying any runoff from the recent rainfall. As he approached the last few seconds of his internal countdown, he got into a runner's starting position, like he was about to compete in a track race. His muscles were coiled and ready for action, his breathing controlled and steady. With one final deep breath to calm his nerves, he took off down the tunnel. Robert picked up the pace quickly, building speed with each stride as his footfalls echoed loudly against the curved concrete walls of the tunnel. The sound carried much further than he would have preferred, but making noise was actually part of the plan this time. As he approached the first doorway that led from the outer loop into the central residential area, he began yelling at the top of his lungs. His voice carried down the connecting tunnel, bouncing off the walls and traveling deep into the maze of passages where the creatures were wandering. The response was almost instant, with several excited moans echoing back toward him as the zombies began moving in his direction. Robert continued running for a few more yards before looking back over his shoulder, watching as several blood-covered figures emerged from the tunnel opening behind him. He let out another loud yell, making sure he had their complete attention and that they would continue following him rather than wandering off in search of other prey. In a matter of seconds, he had 4 zombies chasing after him with single-minded determination. After repeating the same process at the next tunnel opening, 3 more creatures joined the growing pursuit. Robert managed to maintain his pace through the first 100 yards of his planned route, successfully drawing the attention of more than a dozen zombies who were now chasing after him in a ragged line. He continued yelling periodically, hoping to keep their attention focused on him rather than allowing them to become distracted by other sounds or movement. Unfortunately, his yelling was more successful than he had anticipated. The sound of his shouting carried down the length of the outer loop tunnel, pulling additional zombies in from a connecting passage up ahead of his position. Half a dozen creatures popped out of the opening in short order, turning and rushing towards him with the same predatory intensity as the others. Before they could build up to full speed, several more emerged from the next tunnel, opening further up the line. "Damn it," Robert said. Robert kept running as hard as he could, trying to chart a course through the growing mob of creatures that was converging on his position. But he couldn't see a way through. He knew he didn't have the body weight or physical strength to try and break through the crowd like a running back. So he realized his options were becoming increasingly limited with each passing second. His first instinct was to turn and run down one of the side tunnels that led back toward the residential areas. But with all the noise he had been making, it was a virtual guarantee that something was already moving down those passages toward him. Running into a confined space could easily turn into a death trap if he encountered creatures coming from the opposite direction. Instead, he looked to his left, spotting one of the small drainage pipes that connected to the street-level storm drains. The opening was about 8 feet off the ground, well above the reach of the pursuing zombies, but potentially accessible if he could generate enough height with a running jump. Without taking time to second-guess himself, he adjusted his course toward the pipe opening, picking up as much speed as his tired legs could generate. At the precise moment he calculated would give him the best angle, Robert leapt up toward the opening, reaching out with both hands and grabbing onto the lip of the concrete pipe. The impact sent a shock through his shoulders and arms, and his muscles burned as he struggled to support his full body weight while dangling from the narrow ledge. Robert could hear the zombies closing in on his position below, their excited moaning getting louder as they realized their prey was attempting to escape. The sound forced him to lift his legs up quickly, planting his feet against the tunnel wall as he struggled to maintain his grip on the pipe opening. Despite the awkward angle and the strain on his arms, he knew that even one tug on his foot by a creature would be more than enough to send him tumbling to the ground, where he would be overwhelmed in seconds. Robert let out a motivational scream, channeling every ounce of strength and determination he possessed as he fought to pull himself up toward the safety of the pipe. It took tremendous effort and several attempts, but he finally managed to pull his head up, high enough to look inside the drainage opening. His eyes quickly scanned the interior of the pipe, searching for anything that might help him complete his escape. After a moment, he spotted a small metal handhold on the right side of the pipe that had been installed to help maintenance workers navigate the system. He steadied himself as best he could before reaching out with one hand to grab onto the fixture. Once he had a secure grip on the handhold, Robert hung there for a moment to catch his breath, looking down at the swarm of creatures that had gathered below him. The ghouls reached up with their arms extended, moaning in frustration that their meal was tantalizingly just out of reach. Robert examined the pipe opening more carefully, knowing he needed to climb inside if he wanted to be completely safe from the creatures below, but recognizing that maneuvering into the confined space was going to be difficult. "This is going to suck," Robert said. Meanwhile, Nathan was pumping his legs as hard as they would carry him as he approached the gap over the central drainage channel. His eyes got wide when he spotted the opening ahead of him. and he summoned a little extra strength from his reserves before launching himself through the air in a desperate leap. Nathan flew through the air with his arms windmilling for balance, and unlike his previous big jump earlier in the evening, he managed to clear the gap with a few inches to spare. His leading foot landed solidly on the opposite side, but his forward momentum carried him into an uncontrolled tumble that sent him rolling across the concrete surface. He quickly spun around from his prone position, watching with satisfaction and relief as the zombies that had been chasing him plummeted into the drainage channel below. As the last creature ran straight off the edge without any apparent awareness of the drop, Nathan pumped his fist in celebration of his successful escape. "Hell yeah!" Nathan shouted. "Nicely done, sir," Fiona called out. Nathan looked over toward the elevated ledge where Fiona and Ice were sitting safely above the action. He gave them a playful theatrical bow, like an actor accepting applause after delivering a great performance on stage. Thank you, I'll be here all week," Nathan said. Nathan straightened up, looking over toward the two women with a puzzled expression crossing his face as he realized something was missing from the scene. "Wait, where are the others?" Nathan asked. "Robert hasn't gotten here yet. And Vernon," Fiona began. Fiona trailed off, her voice heavy with emotion as she struggled to find the right words to deliver the bad news. She looked toward Ice, silently asking her friend to help explain what had happened. "He didn't make it. A few of those things showed up unexpectedly and he locked all of them behind a gate," Ice said. Nathan paused for a moment, absorbing the tragic news about their friend and feeling the weight of loss settle over him before turning his attention back to the more immediate concern about Robert's whereabouts. "I'm sorry about Vernon, but Robert should have beaten me here. I gave him a 2-minute head start and he's faster than I am," Nathan said. "We heard yelling down that side of the tunnel a few minutes ago, but nothing since," Fiona replied. Nathan's first instinct was to stick to Diesel's plan and remain in position as instructed. However, something in his gut told him that something was wrong with the situation. Robert was reliable and fast, and his absence was cause for concern. "You two stay here. I'm going to go check on him," Nathan said. Nathan didn't wait for them to respond, or try to talk him out of the decision before taking off down the tunnel in the direction Robert should have come from. He ran hard but was careful to minimize his footfalls, not wanting to attract additional creatures to their position while he investigated. As he covered about 30 yards of distance, he could hear a chorus of excited moans coming from somewhere up ahead of his position. The sound was concentrated in one area rather than spread out, suggesting that a large group of creatures had gathered around something that was holding their attention. He slowed down his pace considerably, coming around the next bend in the tunnel to see approximately 30 zombies crowded around one of the drainage pipes that connected to the street level. The creatures were reaching upward and moaning in frustration, clearly agitated by something just out of their reach. Nathan stared at the situation for a moment before he spotted a familiar set of arms dangling from the opening of the pipe above the crowd. "He's going to have to teach me how to climb like that," Nathan said quietly. Nathan pulled out his small flashlight from his pocket, clicking it on and off quickly in a brief signal, just enough to get Robert's attention without attracting the notice of the creatures below. A moment later, the young man began waving from the relative safety of his elevated position, letting Nathan know he was uninjured and aware of the rescue attempt. "Okay, man, you got one more run in you. Come on, get moving," Nathan called out. Nathan let out a primal scream that echoed through the tunnel system, getting the immediate attention of every zombie in the outer loop. In a matter of seconds, they had turned away from their futile attempts to reach Robert and locked onto Nathan's position, breaking into a coordinated sprint in his direction. Nathan turned and picked up the pace, knowing it wasn't too much further before he would reach the gap over the central channel. He could hear the thunderous sound of the horde rampaging behind him, their footsteps and moaning creating a terrifying soundtrack. But he kept yelling the entire way to ensure none of them lost interest in pursuing him. Nathan got the gap into his sight, with Fiona and Ice watching in suspense from their elevated position. As he approached the critical jump, he pushed his legs as hard as they would go, building up maximum speed before pushing off with everything he had right at the edge of the chasm. Unlike his previous successful jump, the exhaustion from his earlier efforts prevented him from getting a full push off from his launching point. He flew through the air with less height and distance than before, barely reaching the other side of the gap. Nathan managed to plant his hands on the opposite ledge, but his legs and torso were still hanging over the drop, leaving him in a precarious position. He struggled desperately to hold his position as the zombies began falling off the ledge behind him, their bodies crashing into the drainage channel below with sickening thuds. As his grip began slipping and he started sliding backward toward the drop, he felt something grab firmly onto his hands. Nathan let out a panicked scream before looking up and seeing that it was Fiona and Ice who had rushed to his aid, grabbing onto his arms to prevent him from falling. "Less screaming, more pulling," Ice said. Nathan nodded his understanding, working together with the two women to pull himself up to safety on the solid ground. After a few moments of coordinated effort, he managed to get his entire body onto the safe side of the gap, and all three of them collapsed to the ground in exhaustion from the rescue effort. "Thank you, I owe you both," Nathan said between heavy breaths. "Damn right you do," Ice replied. "You already owed me for the pie," Fiona added with a smile. Nathan chuckled despite his exhaustion before responding to her comment. "Come on now, Oliver gave that money to both of us," Nathan said. Fiona gave him a playful look, batting her eyes in an exaggerated manner that made her point. "Are you sure?" Fiona asked. Nathan let out a deep sigh of resignation before all three of them broke into a fit of laughter at the absurdity of it all. The moment of levity continued for several seconds before they heard Robert's voice calling out from the other side of the gap where he had successfully made his way down from the drainage pipe. "What did I miss?" Robert asked. "Just Nathan here thinking he's as pretty as Fiona," Ice replied. "That is worthy of a laugh," Robert said. Everyone enjoyed their brief moment of humor and relief, which was quickly overshadowed by the sound of zombies moaning from the drainage channel below their position. The reality of their situation came flooding back as they walked over to their respective ledges, looking down at the horde of creatures that had accumulated in the confined space. The sight of so many former friends and neighbors transformed into mindless predators, snapped them back into the seriousness of the moment, and reminded them that their job was far from over. "Come on, let's get back on the ledge so they stay right there." Chapter 10. Diesel stood at the entrance to the narrow tunnel that led to the emergency release valve deep within the underground infrastructure. The passageway stretched on seemingly forever into the darkness ahead of him, disappearing beyond the reach of any ambient light from the main tunnel system. He could hear the unmistakable sound of moaning coming from somewhere far ahead, though the echoing acoustics made it difficult to determine exactly how many creatures might be lurking in the confined space. There was no light source available for the entire length of the maintenance corridor, and the narrowness of the passage was barely wide enough for his broad shoulders to fit through comfortably. The tunnel had been designed for utility workers to access the emergency systems, not for comfort or easy navigation in crisis situations. He reached into the canvas bag he had slung around his shoulder, pulling out one of the road flares he had retrieved from his emergency supplies. He struck the ignition cap and watched as the flare burst into brilliant crimson flame, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Diesel let the flare burn for a few moments to ensure it was producing maximum light, before drawing his arm back and tossing it down the hallway as hard as he could. The burning cylinder sailed through the air, trailing sparks and smoke before landing on the concrete floor with a metallic clatter. It rolled along for several yards before coming to rest against a slight irregularity in the floor. The area around the flare was suddenly illuminated in bright red light, giving him a clear view of the first 20 yards or so of the tunnel ahead. The walls appeared to be clear of any immediate threats, though he could see that the passage curved slightly to the right, about 15 yards ahead. He gripped his knife firmly in his dominant hand, while holding his flashlight in the other, ready for whatever he might encounter. Diesel moved swiftly down the passageway, his boots echoing softly against the concrete as he covered the distance to the burning flare in a matter of moments. The red light provided good visibility in the immediate area, but beyond its reach, the darkness remained impenetrable. He walked a few yards further past the flare before pulling out another one from his bag and repeating the same process, lighting it and throwing it ahead to illuminate the next section. This methodical progression continued for several cycles, each flare bringing him closer to the valve control room, while also bringing him closer to the source of the moaning sounds that continued to echo through the confined space. The technique was effective for maintaining visibility, but it also meant he was leaving a trail of burning markers that would light his path out if he had to make a run for it. As he reached the location of his most recent flare, he pulled out another one from his dwindling supply, striking the ignition and preparing to throw it ahead. This time, however, instead of sailing down the corridor, the flare smacked against a concrete wall just 5 yards away, clattering to the ground in a shower of sparks. "I knew that was coming up," Diesel said. He had been expecting to encounter a turn in the tunnel system based on his mental map of the underground infrastructure. Diesel walked forward to retrieve the flare and throw it down the next section of hallway, however. As he bent down to pick up the burning cylinder, he heard aggressive moaning coming from just around the corner ahead of his position. He looked up just in time to see a zombie rushing towards him with arms outstretched and mouth open in a snarl. The creature had apparently been drawn by the light from his flares and was moving with the single-minded purpose that characterized all of the creatures. Diesel reacted instinctively, dropping his flashlight and flinging his arm upwards to catch the attacking creature in the midsection. The impact knocked some of the wind out of the zombie, but didn't slow its assault. Diesel managed to extend his arm fully, creating enough space between himself and the creature's snapping teeth to allow him to maneuver his knife into position. He stabbed repeatedly toward the ghoul's head, trying to find the angle that would penetrate the skull and reach the brain. It took several attempts before he managed to hit the target effectively, finally piercing the skull with enough force to render the creature lifeless. The zombie went completely limp in his grasp, the dead weight pressing down on Diesel as he began the process of pushing the corpse away from his body. Before he could complete the task, however, another creature rushed forward from around the corner, slamming into the back of the dead zombie. The impact drove both the corpse and Diesel backward into the concrete wall with a bone-jarring crash that knocked his knife hand away from the weapon and sent him tumbling to the ground. The attacking creature flailed wildly above him, swiping at Diesel and trying to get a firm hold on any part of his body it could reach. The dead zombie's corpse was pressed into Diesel's face by the weight of the second attacker, making it difficult for him to see anything, and rendering his attempts to retrieve his knife virtually impossible. The attacking ghoul continued its relentless assault, scratching up Diesel's arms as he struggled to protect himself, while trapped beneath the dead weight of the first creature. Despite his best efforts to reach his weapon, he couldn't get his hands free enough to grab onto the knife handle. But inspiration struck when he felt the intense heat radiating from the road flare that was still burning nearby. Diesel stretched his arm toward the source of the heat, managing to grab onto the road flare despite the awkward angle and the continued attacks from the creature above him. He carefully positioned the burning cylinder with the flame end pointing upward, creating an improvised weapon that could inflict serious damage on his attacker. With his free hand, Diesel grabbed onto the dead zombie's shirt and used all his strength to fling the corpse aside, finally giving himself a clear view of the creature that was trying to kill him. The ghoul, now with an unobstructed path to its prey, lunged forward with its mouth open wide. Instead of sinking its teeth into flesh as it expected, the creature received the burning end of the road flare directly into its mouth. Diesel angled the flare upward, keeping it pressed firmly against the roof of the ghoul's mouth, while the intense heat began to do its destructive work on the creature's brain tissue. It took several agonizing moments before the heat damage was sufficient to render the creature lifeless. The zombie's struggles gradually weakened and then stopped entirely as the flare continued to burn against the inside of its skull. Once the ghoul stopped moving, Diesel tossed the body aside and picked himself up off the concrete floor. "You better not have any more friends in here," Diesel said. Diesel yanked his knife free from where it had fallen, wiping the blade clean on his pants before returning it to his belt. He pulled out another flare from his bag and lit it up, providing fresh illumination as he continued down the corridor toward his destination. It took a few more minutes of careful navigation before he finally reached the heavy metal door that led to the valve control room. The entrance was marked with faded warning signs about authorized personnel only, though such restrictions seemed meaningless given their current circumstances. He threw the door open forcefully, relieved to discover that he was alone in the small chamber. The room contained the essential controls for the emergency drainage system, and he quickly located a switch on the wall that would power up the basic lighting system. When he flipped the switch, a small solar-powered light fixture activated, providing steady illumination throughout the space. The control room was compact and functional, with a couple of pressure gauges mounted on the wall, along with various pipes and valves. In the center of the room was a large round crank wheel that controlled the main release valve for the internal reservoir system. Diesel walked over to the wall-mounted gauges, checking the readings to confirm that the internal reservoir was approximately half full of water from the recent rainfall. The levels were exactly what he had been hoping for, providing enough volume to create the kind of devastating flood that would clear the creatures from the drainage system. "Oh yeah, we're in business," Diesel said. Diesel looked down at his wrist to check the timer on his watch, seeing that there was less than a minute remaining before the 30-minute deadline he had established with his team. Rather than jumping ahead of schedule, he forced himself to wait patiently, watching the digital countdown tick steadily toward completion. The final seconds seemed to drag on forever as he stood ready to execute the most critical phase of their operation. Just before the alarm would have sounded to indicate the end of the countdown, he clicked the timer off and prepared to open the valve. "Okay, boys, I hope you managed to do your job," Diesel said. Diesel gripped the large crank wheel with both hands, straining against the resistance as he tried to get the mechanism moving. The valve hadn't been operated in months, and the metal components had developed enough corrosion and buildup to make the initial movement extremely difficult. It took considerable effort and persistence, but eventually he managed to get the wheel turning. Round and round the crank went, each full rotation releasing more water from the massive internal reservoir that had been collecting rainfall and runoff from the streets above. Soon he could hear the tremendous rush of water flowing through the large pipes below his position, creating a rumbling sound that indicated the flood was building to full strength. With a quick glance over to the pressure gauge mounted on the wall, he could see that the reservoir was emptying at an acceptable pace that would provide sustained flow for several minutes. "That should be strong enough to wash away whatever is down there," Diesel said. Diesel left the drain valve open in its fully released position as he began working his way back through the narrow corridor, following the trail of burning flares that marked his route. After several minutes of careful navigation through the maintenance tunnel, he emerged back into the main tunnel system and began making his way through the familiar passages toward the central drainage area. The sound of rushing water was audible throughout the underground complex, confirming that the flood was operating as intended. When he finally reached the main observation area, he spotted the 4 other survivors standing on the elevated ledge, looking down at the torrent of water flowing through the drainage channel below. Diesel noticed that Vernon wasn't among the group, and his heart sank a bit. "Did it work?" Diesel asked. "Oh yeah, that water hit them like a tractor trailer, sent them flying," Nathan replied. "Were you able to get all of them?" Diesel asked. "There were probably 50 or 60 of them down there," Robert said. "But we're going to have to check one of the tunnels once the flood dies down," Fiona added. "Vernon is—" Ice began. Ice trailed off as Diesel put his hand up, seeing the pain on her face at the mention of their fallen friend's name. He understood, without needing to hear the details, that Vernon had made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the success of their mission. "It's okay. We'll take care of it," Diesel said. The group continued standing in silence for several minutes, watching the floodwaters flowing freely through the channel system as they carried away the remains of their former community members. After several minutes of quiet observation, a familiar voice called out from behind them, breaking the contemplative mood that had settled over the group. "Diesel, where are you at?" Wanda called. "Wanda, why aren't you hiding?" Diesel replied. "Oh, I know you boys always take care of everything, so I didn't think I needed to do it anymore," Wanda said. Diesel let out a disbelieving chuckle at the older woman's casual confidence in their abilities, motioning for her to join them at the observation point. "What's going on, Wanda?" Diesel asked. "Something weird is going on outside, and you need to see it," Wanda said. "Is it weirder than what's been going on in here?" Nathan asked. "I think so. Come on," Wanda replied. The group followed Wanda through a series of connecting tunnels to a small landing area that provided access to the surface through an emergency exit. She opened the heavy metal door and motioned for Diesel to step outside and see what had captured her attention. "I could hear something from my spot, but didn't want to unlock the front door, so I came over here and saw this. I've lived here longer than I can remember, and I've never seen anything like it," Wanda explained. Diesel nodded and stepped through the doorway, with the others following close behind him. They emerged onto a raised platform that was positioned about 20 yards above the desert floor, providing an excellent vantage point for observing the surrounding area. Directly across the open space sat the local college football stadium, a familiar landmark that they had seen countless times. Typically at this time of night, the stadium would be completely dark and deserted, with only minimal security lighting around the perimeter. Tonight, however, the entire facility was not only fully illuminated, but there was an incredible amount of military activity taking place throughout the area. Dozens of military trucks were coming and going from the main entrance in a steady stream of organized traffic, while a handful of transport helicopters were landing and taking off from the field inside the stadium itself. The level of activity suggested a major emergency response operation was underway, far beyond anything they would expect to see in their relatively quiet corner of Las Vegas. The group stared in disbelief at the scene for several minutes, trying to process the implications of what they were witnessing. The scale of the military presence suggested that whatever was happening was much larger than what was happening in their small underground community. "Diesel, what do you think?" Wanda asked. Diesel contemplated the scene for several long moments, his military experience helping him recognize the signs of a major crisis response operation before formulating his response. "And I don't know what's going on over there, but I think it's a sign that things are a whole lot worse out there than anybody knows. The end."